This is a short podcast just to go over some of the main ideas that we saw in the lecture on co-ownership. So we saw that there are only two possible forms of co-ownership. One is the joint tenancy, and we said the characteristics of the joint tenancy is that there must be the four unities of time, title, interest and possession. The idea of shares is completely contrary to the idea of a joint tenancy. There are no shares in a joint tenancy. Each co-owner owns the entire estate. If a husband and wife are joint tenants of their home, it means that each of them is a 100% owner of the home. And then the right of survivorship follows on from that. If one of them dies, then there's now only one 100% owner of the home. So if the husband dies first, it's not that he transfers his share to his wife, it's simply that he disappears from the ownership picture, leaving his wife as the only owner of the property. This is known as the right of survivorship, or jus accrescendi. The alternative possibility is tenancy in common, and here, that although we might have, for instance, unities of time and title, they're not necessary to the idea of a tenancy in common. Only the unity of possession is present. That is, that each co-owner has a right to be in possession. Unlike joint tenants, it is right to speak of shares when you speak of a tenancy in common. Each tenant in common has their own share, 50% of the estate or 70% of the estate, whatever it might be. But whether the co-owners are joint tenants or tenants in common, they always have the right to possession. And if one co-owner excludes another from possession without consent, without agreement, then that's called ouster. As you see from this screen, ouster is a denial by one co-owner of another co-owner's right to possession. And it's a question of fact. The court has to decide on the facts whether or not what's taken place amounts to exclusion, amounts to ouster. And now we're going to look at this idea that we know about the possibility of legal ownership and equitable ownership, that there's the possibility of drawing that distinction. And in the case of co-ownership, one possibility is that there is a joint tenancy of a legal estate, but a tenancy in common in equity. There's a joint tenancy of the legal estate because the property has been conveyed into the name of the co-owners, and the conveyance declares that they are joint tenants. So that's the common law picture, the picture that's painted by the title deeds. But equity might paint a different picture, and this could happen in three ways. First of all, there could be an express trust, so that there's a joint tenancy of the legal estate, but the joint tenants are holding on trust. The second is the possibility of an implied trust. There's a joint tenancy of the legal estate, but there's a resulting trust or a common intention constructive trust, so that in equity there's some kind of tenancy in common. And the third way in which we could get that difference between the joint tenancy in law but a tenancy in common in equity is that the co-owners started as joint tenants, but later there's been some severance that only takes effect in equity. So the legal joint tenancy continues, but there is now an equitable tenancy in common. This little slide or diagram is just intended to say the same thing, but in diagrammatic form. So the legal title, the picture painted by the title deeds, might show that there's a joint tenancy, but we can ask whether the title deeds tell the full ownership picture, because in the ways that we've just seen, express trust, resulting trust, common intention constructive trust, an enforceable contract, so that there's a constructive trust again, or an equitable severance of a legal joint tenancy. In any of those ways, we could have an equitable tenancy in common even though there's a legal joint tenancy. So this idea that we might start with joint tenancy but convert the joint tenancy into tenancy in common. And that process of converting a joint tenancy into a tenancy in common is called severance. For the severance to take effect at common law, for it to be a legal severance, it has to be carried out in the ways specified in section 8.1 of the Conveyancing and Property Ordinance, either by notice or instrument. And since those methods involve writing and affect the ownership of land, they should be registered with the Land Registry. Or alternatively, there could be a method of severance that doesn't take effect at common law, so leaves the common law joint tenancy in place, but does take effect in equity. And we saw that that means an act operating on a tenant share, mutual agreement, or a course of dealing intimating that the interests of all the joint tenants were mutually treated by them as having been converted into a tenancy in common. Finally, we looked at the possibility of a complete end to any kind of co-ownership, and that's the idea of partition. So partition brings co-ownership to an end and gives rise to ownership in just one name. It could be achieved by agreement between the parties, and then they can simply give effect to that agreement by deed. So they might agree that from now on this part of our co-owned property belongs to you and that part of the co-owned property belongs to me. If the parties can't agree, then any co-owner has a right to apply to the court under the partition ordinance. They can apply for partition, for a physical division of the property between them, or they can apply for an order for sale. That is, they can ask the court that the property be sold, and then the proceeds of sale should be divided between them. And that's the end of this brief podcast.